Welcome, everybody, to the latest edition of On Track Live. I think we'll have some folks joining late, and as usual, a number of folks have started using this thing like a podcast and check into the recording afterwards. Just so you know that that's always an option for you if you're unable to make the time work. But welcome back from our hiatus from our conference last month. We're really excited for our guest this month. You're going to love this conversation. We're going to switch things up. I usually open with some news updates and some shameless self-promotion for NCTA, but we're going to dispense with that because our guest has a hard stop at the top of the hour. So we're going to dive right into the conversation here because I know you're going to want to hear what she has to say. Mandy Gunasekera is former chief of staff for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under the Trump administration. Prior to that, she spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, where she was a great friend to energy people like us. She has now authored a book, which is sitting to her right there, but also, I hold it up to my head and see if I can make the camera work. It never does. Anyway, it's a great book title. Y'all Fired: Southern Bell's Guide to Restoring Federalism and Draining the Swamp. It's a great read, and without any further ado, let's just start the conversation. Mandy, you describe yourself in the book as both an Army brat and a Southern belle. How, maybe to start, just let everybody know how you wound up on a path that ended up in the executive suite of the Environmental Protection Agency.
Yeah, well, sometimes I ask myself that. But John, thank you for the introduction, the opportunity, and Melinda, wonderful to connect with you as well. We have a ton of mutual friends, and so it's fun to play the name game with you. But I'll jump right into that question. Yeah, I grew up, my father was active duty Air Force, actually, so Air Force brat. And I had a mom from a very, very rural town called Decatur, Mississippi, father from coastal town, Mississippi, and she ended up marrying him. He was active duty Air Force. They had me and my brother, and so we used to move around the country every 2 years until I was 13. My brother as well, and we had one stint overseas in Korea. And what was interesting, I think if you talk to anyone who's a military brat, they're going to have a similar experience where you're moving around all the time. Your focus on family, community, and service to the country, it was things that we talked about every day. When we got orders to move somewhere, it was always very upsetting, especially for me as an elementary, junior high gal. And I have essays of when I was writing about how I was heartbroken, but service to the country mattered because we lived in the greatest country in the world. And I didn't put this in the book, but something that had a big impact on how I view the world and how I was very aware as a 10-year-old of being in a country of freedom, opportunity, and abundance versus a country that had none of those things. When I was 10, my father was stationed at Osan Air Force Base, is in South Korea. We went to the demilitarized zone. If any of y'all have ever been there, it is a stark line, and you can literally see what the face of oppression is. And I saw that with the North Korean soldiers versus the South Korean soldiers, and you just look across the border and it's absolutely desolate. And then, of course, if you look at, you can now look at satellite photos, you can see the lights on the south and the darkness in the north, and it is representative of access to freedom, opportunity, those who are willing to fight and serve for it, versus a country that that isn't, by virtue of really bad, poor leadership and a lack of the individual citizen having a voice and a role in the governing decisions of their country. So as a 10-year-old, I knew that. My father retired when I was 13. I spent my formidable years growing up in rural Mississippi. Let me paint the picture when I say that. It's about 800 people. We do have one red light and a couple of four-way stops, but that's about it. And I grew up in this really strong, close-knit community, going to church at least twice a week, lots of potlucks with the church family, things along those lines. So when I graduated from high school, went to college, and I was thinking what I wanted to do, I was very interested in Washington, D.C. I was early on a communications major, but my father encouraged me to go to D.C. and do internships. So first summer after my freshman year, did an internship, fell in love with the energy of D.C. and being a part of our constitutional republic. having firsthand the ability to engage, even as a young know nothing freshman out of college, I was blown away by it. And one of my favorite things to do, I still love to do this when I have the chance, is to give tours of the Capitol. If you've ever served as an intern or you know someone, that's one of your big jobs. So love of country, wanted to figure out how I fit into this broader picture of service. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I wanted to be in DC. Came back, finished undergrad, went to law school, ended up going to DC. And one of my internships I did in the Office of General Counsel at the Energy and Commerce Committee was during the summer of cap and trade. This was 2009, 2010. I worked for Chairman Barton. He was head of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Again, I was just a know-nothing intern in the back corner looking up the emissions profiles of various industrial activities and things that we use. But being thrown into the summer of cap and trade and having to do side-by-side analysis of Waxman-Markey and then kind of break it down and figure out how did this impact people, I was thrown and forever deep into the world of environmental legislation, environmental policy, its impact on energy development, and its broader implications for the economy. So that's how I started, served in the House, served in the Senate, and then ultimately ended up being tapped to go in initially in a more technical role at the Office of Air and Radiation, where I helped define President Trump's climate agenda, where I helped him get out of the Paris Climate Accord. I was the architect of that whole process, briefing him, coming up with the various memos to make the case. You may know this, it was surprising at the time, it's been pretty well covered, but early in the administration, I called them the Goldman Sachs crew, but there were a lot of folks who the president knew from his time in New York. He brought them in to work in various roles in the White House, and a lot of them wanted to just stay in the Paris Climate Accord, which was a bad deal, number one, and number two, he had promised the American people he was going to get out of it. So we were outnumbered. I say we because it was me, the first administrator, Scott Pruitt, and like two other people that were regularly briefing the president saying, no, we don't need a seat at that table. That was a lot of the arguments. No, the Paris Climate Accord does actually have serious consequences. I know they're saying it's all voluntary and we don't have to do these sorts of things, but the problem is we've signed up for this agreement and the Obama administration defined it by instituting what he called the Climate Action Plan. And that included everything from the original Clean Power Plan to methane regulations for existing sources. We always knew they were going to try to tack that onto new sources, vehicle controls, skewing cost-benefit analyses so that co-benefits would tip the scales so you could justify regulating anything. All of the worst regulations had been not done under the umbrella of the Paris Climate Accord. So that was, I took it a little bit further, John, in how we got to things that are relevant to today, and then some of the things I open up with the book. But I'll stop there and see if you want to keep guiding me through it.
No, that is great color, Mandy. Appreciate the background. Where in that journey did you become exposed to and convinced that there is a thing called the deep state? And once you wound up at, I'll make this a two-part question. Where in your life journey did you become familiar with the fact that that's a thing? And once you got to EPA, was it, what further light did you get on that once you were actually inside the animal?
Yeah, I would say I had a front row seat really when I was in the Senate. I was serving as majority counsel for Chairman Jim Inhofe, who was head of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. I had been charged with doing oversight of the Obama administration's air and climate agenda. And I was also very involved with the international piece, domestic and international. So I was the Republican going to the pre-meetings and then the COPs, the Conference of the Parties, that in 2015 resulted in the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I was I could tell I was being gaslit along the way, even as the Senate staffer for the chairman of the committee that had direct jurisdiction over all of these issues from the EPA regulatory side and from the State Department side. I could just tell we weren't given the whole picture. There was a lack of transparency. There was a lack of honesty. And you may remember this, John, as well as the folks who were on, leading up to the Paris Climate Accord, there was a famous quote from the equivalent of the Secretary of State John Kerry at the time was working with a gentleman named Lawrence Fabian, who is the French Secretary of State equivalent. And he said on the record that he was colluding with U.S. negotiators to ensure that the Paris Climate Agreement was structured in a way that they could circumvent the Senate advice and consent process. And I'm paraphrasing a bit, but the quote was, "We essentially have to find a way to go around the United States, because if they have a say in it, if the people, they will not join it." And so I was outside looking in. I didn't understand the full gravity of it. So fast forward, after we get Scott Pruitt confirmed as the first administrator before Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, I jump over to the administration, join his team, and we are thrown into the Paris negotiations. Now, it's an interesting feeling going from the Senate, where you know where everyone stands. There's the Democrats and the Republicans, and you know who everyone works for, and it's pretty much out there. You still get along, but you know where everyone stands. When you walk into a room with agency bureaucrats, you have no idea who's there actually serving their role as a civil servant and who is sitting there figuring out ways to figuratively stab you in the back. Policy-wise, or what was novel in the Trump administration personally. And so one of the things where I was really smacked in the face with the reality of the deep state and the way that they operate against Trump appointees that was different than in the past, even Bush appointees. They really ramped it up a notch. Was when after we got out of the Paris Climate Accord, you can imagine I earned a lot of enemies in that process. People who their whole relevance was attached to the Paris Agreement. And I knew this going into, but again, you do what's right and you deal with the consequences later. And in this instance, you work for the president, he gives a direction, and you do what he requests. That is what you do. You serve at the pleasure of the president. So we did all of this. After we got out, he had asked some of us, or tasked some of us, to renegotiate the deal to come up with something better. So later that year, the Conference of the Parties, again, the International Climate Meeting, was held in Bonn, Germany. I went as a part of the president's team. Now, I had gone previously as a Senate staffer, but not as a part of the president's team. I go there, show up. When you travel as a federal employee, there are teams of people that handle your logistics. And it usually is spearheaded through the consulate, the US consulate in the country you're visiting. In this instance, it was Frankfurt, Germany. I don't think twice about the logistics, how I fly, how a taxi, where I stay, none of that, until I show up in Germany. And I realize, after everything that could possibly go wrong on a trip, me and one other female colleague, that we're a part of a delegation, mind you, of over 120 people. Two of us end up out at this hotel. That first red flag, it was out in the beautiful countryside, but it was in the countryside. So a solid 45 minutes away from where the actual negotiations were happening. That was red flag number one for me. Red flag number two was 15 minutes in this hotel, I realized that they had put us in a sex hotel, which is crazy. And when I told them about it, it was very clear that this wasn't just a slip up. This was a planned form of harassment, where the message was, we are going to make your life a living hell. We have lots of tools and ways that we can do it. And it was very clear to me that not only is there a deep state, but that deep state was organized to demean, discredit, and demoralize anyone who was working for President Trump, number one, and especially those who were willing to enact the policy directions that he actually gave. So, that was it. The wool was pulling off my eyes, and I realized that there is a festering problem here. And it got even worse in the sense that I filed a report, I built a whole case, I presented it to the people, and nothing happened. So how is it? I grew up in a world where my father's serving this country. I understand the role of service and sacrifice in a constitutional republic where the individual, we not only have rights and liberties, but our role in this whole process really does matter. How is it, fast forward many years, you can end up in a situation where not only is it absurd in a political sense to a political appointee in any professional setting, if that happened, people would lose their jobs, people would be fired. Something would change, a process was changed, nothing happened. And it was a few weeks later, I had to go to a White House meeting. They called them Policy Coordinating Committee. PCCs with the same group of people who I knew were responsible for that whole experience. And it was like, well, I guess we'll just move on to the next thing and pretend like nothing happened. There's a problem when the unaccountable, unelected bureaucrat that tries to purposefully divert policy decisions coming from the president and then demoralize, demean, and discredit the people trying to do that on his behalf when nothing happens. And so that, again, it was the experience that set me on this path that ultimately led to the writing of this book.
Interesting. And you mentioned how that was ramped up under Trump, even over how they behaved under previous Republican administrations. I mean, your opening scene in the forward of the book is that this hasn't stopped since you've been out of the administration. Didn't you get a subpoena from the OIG or?
Yeah, no, I had just a few months ago. I was out of town. My husband was in town, but 2 FBI agents and a representative from the EPA Office of Inspector General showed up to my office in Oxford, Mississippi to deliver a subpoena request. And it pertains to work that I did under President Trump. So it is the latest iteration of the deep state weaponizing their responsibility against people that they do not want going back in the administration, or if they think you're going to be nominated for something, they want to try and muddy the waters around you so that someone on the Democrat could say, well, so-and-so is under investigation. And I'm not the only one. There's quite a few. There's some that have captured the headlines. Obviously, what's happening to President Trump, that's Exhibit A. But the people around him, Jeff Clark, he's an attorney at the Department of Justice. I worked closely with him. He's been on the receiving end of this type of activity. And then I received it. I got my love letter, if you will, this summer. And it just goes to show you that the deep state continues to work against those who want to break them apart and rightfully restore balance that's been missing in our constitutional republic.
Great. We should jump to that. And by the way, we've got Mandy for a limited amount of time, but if anybody does have a question, go ahead and type that into the chat. Now would be a good time. We've got Mandy for about 10 more minutes. Let's go to the meat. Let's go to the meat of the book here. And you've got some recommendations. You know, breaking this, we'll stick with the deep state term, breaking this deep state and restoring federalism, in your words, is not a simple process. Could you maybe give a quick overview of some tangible steps you think could take place, and how long is it going to take, even if we can muster the political willpower to do this?
Yeah, let me start with the last question, and then I'll go into some of the specifics. It's going to take more than one administration to actually fix this. But what's really important is recalibrating where we've been going. I was born in 1984, and I did a lot of research into this. Really, not since the FDR Constitution that usurped our original constitutional republic. I get into that into the wonky section where I do a historical deep dive. But nonetheless, ever since that time frame, I've only ever known the government as a growing mechanism. Never have I seen it shrink in size and scope or seriously follow an assessment that has shown duplicity or wasted funds from that actually being fixed. So what's really important is recalibrating this idea that agencies, if there's a problem, FEMA, for example, they shouldn't just have billions of more taxpayer dollars poured in. They have a $20 billion budget, but they can't figure out how to effectively deliver disaster relief in the face of hurricanes that have been happening since the existence of the United States of America and the existence of FEMA. They shouldn't get more money. There should be an audit for what went wrong and why are there so many taxpayer dollars being wasted. That is not the mentality right now. And a lot of this stems from the role of Congress. They get budget requests. They're under a lot of pressure in these emergency situations. They eventually succumb to that pressure and say, okay, federal agency, here's $1 bajillion more. Go do it better this time. We've got to shift that. And let me say this too. Conservatives retook the Supreme Court, and it took decades of resources. It took decades of training and commitment to a vision of taking this activist, the Supreme Court that had been turned into an activist place for judges to institute the ideas of the progressive left back to its original constitutional small c conservative role. So that is one example of it can be done, and it has been done. For other institutions, we can do the same thing for the administrative state. And some of the things that I would recommend there's structural changes and there's technical changes. Structural include the budget. A lot of people roll their eyes and say, oh, the budget is just the rubber stamp process. this is where Congress can actually assert its role, but you need the administration leading the charge. After President Trump wins, he's going to have just a few months, a few weeks really, to do the transition. The majority of that, besides figuring out who they're going to hire to bring in, it should be, what does our first budget look like? And my recommendation, I'm calling it a 30 for 30, but let's cut 30% of the federal government within the first 30 days. So that's every single agency needs to cut its size and scope and its resources, full-time employees, number of offices, and it's all done through the filter of what actually contributes to the mission of the agency, not the politicized, distorted mission, but the actual congressionally delegated mission, what contributes to that and what doesn't. And if it doesn't, or there's a lack of accountability or a lack of transparency, get rid of it. And so, number one, yes, it's a budgeting exercise, but it's really important. Number two is moving major roles, major offices outside of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is over 90% Democrat. It is a select representative of the type of people throughout this country, and the agencies are full of one singular minority version, minority ideological approach to the federal government. You need to move major functions out so that you can, one, expand the type of people who may want to actually work in the agencies, but also so the agencies are closer to the people that they actually regulate. So some of it's moving. The technical pieces include things like Schedule F. This was not really implemented, but it was floated towards the end of the Trump administration in 2020. I was serving as the chief of staff. It is a great tool, and it is one step to eventually reestablishing merit-based decision-making within the hiring authority of the federal government. There's front-end things you can do, and there's back-end things that you can do. But using Schedule F as one technical tool is something the president can do. Number two is getting rid of any non-merit-based decision-making on the front end. This has distorted what the federal government actually looks like. It's not really representative of the people writ large. So those are just a few examples. The other piece is breaking apart the public sector unions. Again, they shouldn't exist. And if you've been reading newspapers, they've been trying to quote unquote Trump-proof all of the agencies because they're increasingly concerned. This is unconstitutional. It flies in the face of the way the federal government should operate. And all you need is an administrative head who has the courage to actually use the powers they have to fix the size and scope of the federal government. President Trump has that, and he also has some really good allies to help him in the process who've already committed to it, people like Elon Musk, RFK Jr., and Vivek Ramaswamy. So all that being said, there's tangible steps laid out more in the book, but I feel that this is coming at a time where there is this momentum. People see the problem, they're committed to fixing it, and they know what to do.
Awesome. I got 4 minutes, so here's the big wrap-up question. When the book went to press, Joe Biden hadn't dropped out of the race yet. So I'm curious to know your view on where you see not just the presidential election heading, but also what happens in the Senate and House, and do the Republicans need to sweep all three in order to start effectuating the kind of change you just outlined?
Yeah, it's obviously easy if you sweep all three. And I think the Senate, let me start there. The map looks fairly good for Republicans. That's always been the case. We're defending fewer seats, and there's few incumbents that are stepping aside. West Virginia is one example where it's expected to go R. You also have a really good candidate and a shift once and for all potentially in Montana and Ohio. You've got Sherrod Brown and John Tester. Again, their political positioning has been out of fashion with the way that their state has ultimately been voting, especially during presidential election years. So those are some big opportunities. I feel fairly good about the Senate. The House is a different story. A lot of the seats that we're defending, what really tipped the scale, they're in places like New York and California. So it's harder to keep those areas red, especially just given the broader narrative of what's going on. The House is definitely going to be a fight, but I think Republicans have been much better at picking quality candidates, generally speaking, quality candidates. And then you also have the Trump effect. Whenever President Trump is on the ballot, you bring up voters who don't always engage in the votes, and that should bode well for the Republican, whoever's for the down ballot ticket, for the rest of the down ballot. I will say I think Trump's going to win. I am a rosy optimist, but I try to level set all of that. I'll use something. My husband did a fairly deep dive into this the other day. If you look at national polls, and national polls, they're not really worth much, but nonetheless, let's just look at the national polls. It's a dead heat, and Biden was up by like 6 points, and then he won by 40,000 votes overall, 40 to 60,000, give or take a few. And so the fact that Kamala Harris, even at the state level, some of these state specific polls is in a dead heat or she's behind, even though it's by minimal amounts, the polls always favor Democrats. They just do. And if she's not up by at least 5 to 6 points, then it's not even. She's losing much more. And you can see the desperation on the Democrat side. I'm not sure if any of you call the latest "I'm a man and I support Kamala Harris" commercial that came out. It's cringe. And everyone knows that. Even the people who created it are like, oh my gosh, that was probably a waste of time and a flop from the creative sense. They're super desperate. She's trying to buy off Black male voters. She has her opportunity agenda coming out, and everyone just sees through it. It's sick politics. And the greatest thing about President Trump, if I may just jump on this really quick, is that he changed the expectation of the voter from politicians saying one thing and then setting aside the election agenda once they get into office, because some of these things are hard to do. He just went ahead and did it. And so voters now know if you say something on the campaign trail, you better mean it. And the problem with Kamala Harris, she's been the vice president for 3.5 years. The media and everyone's been trying to run away from that reality, but it's kind of hard to do. I do think a gift for Republican operatives is this disjointedness between Team Biden and Team Harris. I mean, there's a lot there. We could talk about that for 30 minutes, but nonetheless, I think the momentum is such that it's all going towards President Trump's, it favors President Trump actually winning, alongside ground game that the Republican Party has been working on since the 2020 election fallout, from a legal perspective, from an operative perspective, and getting people signed up and ready to vote.
So, and I know one more quick question. Does that mean, it felt like the first Trump administration, they won and it took a little while to get everything geared up and going. Are they going to be better prepared to hit the ground running this time if Trump wins?
Absolutely. And I was a part of, I know Project 2025, it's been painted in a negative way, and President Trump has had to distance himself because of the media trying to take a policy handbook and turning it into a political weapon. But nonetheless, Project 2025 isn't the only symbol of conservatives really digging down and trying to make sure the next opportunity that conservatives have at running this country, we don't lose any time. There are a ton of nonprofits, many involved in Project 2025. I think it's the best one, not just because I worked on it, but because it was this collective effort of so many conservative nonprofits. But there's others out there. I think once President Trump gets over the election, wins, everyone's going to hit the ground running, and that they're going to take the transition much more serious than the last go round. There are people who are in charge who've done this before, and that obviously always helps as well.
Absolutely. And I'll join you. That criticism of Project 2025, it amazed me. This is a bad thing that you've actually got a plan and are telling people what you're going to do. That just, hey. It's kind of mind blowing. Mandy, I know you got to run. You got a hard stop. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'll do a pitch for the book. It's on Amazon.com. That's where I got mine. I'm sure you can find it other places. Just Google "Y'all Fired" and it'll pop up. So, Mandy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Really
wonderful. Wonderful to be with you. Thanks for having me.
We'll be chatting. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, Mandy. We'll just wrap up with a little bit of the stuff we do at the beginning of On Track Live before. Quick news updates. There's been a lot going on over at STB, Surface Transportation Board, in the past couple of months. We had the 2-day hearing on railroad growth strategies, which was called by the new STB chairman, Robert Primus, asking for folks to come in and talk about, hey, why aren't railroads growing volumes and what can be done to help that? Also, just last week, we had the Rail Energy Transportation Advisory Committee meetings that are held a couple times a year. RETAC, NCTA was represented at both of these hearings, the growth hearings and RETAC, by our president, Emily Regas, who did a great job of presenting the perspective of coal shippers and the utility segment in particular. We'll have we did have some coverage in the On Track on the growth hearings previously. Tomorrow's On Track will have some links and some recap of coverage of what happened at the RETAC meeting next week. So keep your eyes on the digital On Track when it comes out. We'll have some stuff on that. On the EPA front, where Mandy used to work, we've now been through the huge rash of new regulations coming out trying to beat the Congressional Review Act, and the litigation process is starting on a lot of those. On the bad news side, the Supreme Court decided not to stay implementation of the Mercury Rule. The headlines you'll read are a little inaccurate. I mean, the headlines you'll read say Supreme Court clears the path for these mercury regulations. That's not what happened. What happened is the Supreme Court refused to stay the implementation of those while the litigation proceeds. So that litigation will be ongoing. The bigger rules, of course, is the new, version 2.0 Clean Power Plan, the carbon regulations. That one, the court has not ruled yet whether to stay it or not. So that one's still out there. There's also a major coal ash rule out there, the legacy coal ash rule, that is now starting implementation. There are requests to stay that one as well, but the courts haven't ruled yet on whether that one will get stayed. So we'll keep our eye on those things. Finally, you may have noticed there's this here election going on in a couple of weeks. I think a lot of us are getting to the point now where we're going to be glad when we get to that milestone and actually have it. I'm not sure anybody's minds are being changed at this point, but we're going to take the next edition of On Track Live, which will happen in November, and we're going to dedicate that to doing a post-mortem on the elections and wherever they sit at that point. It'll only be a couple of weeks past the election, so I'm sure there's still going to be probably some litigation going on and maybe some states still counting votes. Who knows? But we're going to take the next On Track Live and dedicate that to a post-mortem of the election and maybe some prognostication of what that means going into the new year for the energy business and for the rail shippers that we represent. I'm not sure who we'll have for a guest for that yet. May wait until the election happens, and depending on which way it goes, we'll select some other folks to get on and chat a little bit about what the elections may mean. And then finally, let me just do the shameless self-promotion. The dates are set for next spring's NCTA conferences. The spring and O&M meetings will be held May 19th to the 22nd. We'll be in San Antonio, Texas, at a lovely new brand spanking new Intercontinental Hotel near the Riverwalk in San Antonio. It'll be a great venue. We're looking at adding a new feature next spring. We're in the process now of putting together a short course, which will be a day-long come up to speed, everything you know. With the number of people we've got retiring right now, new folks coming into the industry, we're going to put together a day-long session that's Rail Shipper 101. So that you can send your new people or folks who may be new to their roles, be able to get a really good basic education before we go into some traditional conference programming for the rest of the week. We'll also be running the spring and O&M meetings concurrently, so you'll have a much bigger group to be networking with for the social activities and the other stuff that we put on there. So mark your calendars, May 19 to 22. NCTA spring and O&M meetings and short course, so don't miss it. With that, I think that's a pretty good update. Again, Mandy only had 30 minutes for us, but I think it was a very enlightening conversation. And it's and the book's a good read. So I would recommend it if you want to get wonky and do some politics. It's a great read on what's going on and gives you somewhat of a roadmap of what might happen if there is a second Trump turn. So with that, let me throw it out there one more time. Anybody, any old business, new business, anybody wants to bring up before we let you go? Melinda, you got anything to add? Or okay, I've done the same with shameless self-promotion, so Melinda gives me the thumbs up that it's okay to end. I'm going to use my new favorite term that never happened before the pandemic, but now that we do all these virtual meetings, I'm going to give you back 22 minutes of your schedule today, as if I owned them in the first place. So thank you everybody for chiming in today. It was a little bit shorter meeting, but I think very well worthwhile, and we'll see you on Track Live next month to talk about what happened with these here elections. Thanks, everybody.